Hello everyone and welcome to this online presentation, which is my last public online presentation for the year. And I want to talk about, as a futurist, you're probably not surprised that I'm going to be talking about the future. And I want to talk about some trends for all of us as leaders in our jobs and in our roles. And I'm assuming, by the way that I promoted this, that most people attending will be leaders in some sort of role. You may be a business owner, you may be a senior leader, you may be a team leader, and even if you're not in a leadership role yet, we all have to take on leadership characteristics, whether or not we have leader in our job title. So I want to share with you some of the key trends that some of the research is saying that we should be mindful of if we're leaders leading into 2022. I know a lot of people who are here today, who are here live. I know there are also a lot of people watching this recording. And for those who don't know me, my name's Gihan Pereira. I'm a futurist, a business futurist, and I do a lot of work around Australia and the region mainly, but also internationally. You can find out a lot more about me at gihanpereira.com, because I don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about me. It's going to be more about you and about us. I do work with a lot of leadership teams. These are just some examples of some of the leadership groups I've worked with. And you can see there's a range of them. And many of them are facing the same issues. So the trends that I'm going to share with you today are not specific to any industry. They're not specific to any size of organization. Perhaps the only little way that they are a little bit influenced in non-global scale is that they're probably more applicable to Australian organizations than others. However, generally the principles that we talk about today are applicable to everybody. We've got 45 minutes today, and I like to make my presentations interactive, even my online presentations. So my 3 rules of engagement. One, I want to give you things to think about. So I want you to if you can, avoid any other interruptions and distractions, and think a bit bigger here in this time that we've got together than you would in your everyday operations. So get rid of some of the obstacles and problems that might get in the way of doing stuff, and think big. And then if you need to walk it back later when life gets in the way, that's okay, but it's easier to do it that way than the other way around. I want you to be a bit playful today. So if you're here live, it's a bonus for you, because we will be quite interactive. We've got some engagement, there's some polls, there's some activities, there's some ways for you to get involved. If you're watching the recording, hello there, it's not as good an experience for you, but you can do other things as well, like pause and rewind and go through things again, share things with your team. So be a bit playful in this session. And mostly, I want to give you some things that you can take away and put into action when we finish. So that's my goal here, to really give you an action plan of a few things that you can take into 2022. It's very much about that. In fact, a few weeks ago, as part of my research looking at leadership for 2022, did a whole bunch of research, and I put together this video which summarizes 10 essential post-pandemic leadership skills. And that's available. If you go to gihanpereira.tv later, then you can watch that video. But I'm not going to share with you today 10 of them, because for 2 reasons. One is, why would I do that? You might as well watch the video. But second, if I try to do 10, we will only be able to cover them superficially. So we're only going to do a few. So we probably get through 3, maybe 4 if we get time. But if it's really interactive and engaging, then maybe we'll only do 3 of them. But if we do 3, I think that's really good, because we'd have done 3 to a level where I think you'd have something substantial that you can actually take away and use, rather than just an idea that you walk away thinking, yeah, that was interesting, but what can I do with it? Okay, so to get us started, I want to share with you, and I want to teach you 2 tools that I use whenever I run masterclasses about scenario planning, about leadership, about innovation. These are 2 really useful tools for when you get an idea, how do you then convert that into actual actionable steps? So what I'd like you to do for your action plan is, if you can, please grab a piece of paper and a pen, or pencil, or iPad and finger, and let's do it this way. So turn it sideways so you've got it landscape. And let me turn my camera on there so you can see that. And just rule it into 3 columns. So this is your action plan from today's presentation. And there are 3 things, so 3 headings. So the first one is the actual action that you're going to take away. And then, can you write here? So this is goal or action. Uch in the second column and who in the third column. Okay, let me explain what those other two columns are. So the goal and the action is like what you're actually going to do. And then let's talk about ooching and who. So the first one of those is ooching. So ooching is a term from sailing. So ooching happens when you're out on a boat and the wind drops completely and it's absolutely becalmed and you don't know what to do. So ooching just means try something. Do something small, see what happens, and then based on that, decide what you're going to do next. So in the context of what we're talking about today, ooching means what's your first step going to be? So you don't exactly know the full plan to achieve your goal, to reach your outcome, but what's your first step that you can take? And ideally a step that will give you some information about whether you're on the right track or not. Now, if you think ooch doesn't sound very professional, you might want to call it a prototype. So what sort of prototype would you build? What sort of pilot project will you run? Just to get started, just to find out if you're on the right track. If you're familiar with the whole design thinking process, design thinking has an element called ooching. It's not called that, but design thinking says, first of all, find out what problems your customers have. And then before you build a solution for them, do an experiment. So build a prototype, run a pilot project, work with a small group of key customers. Now, today we're not only going to be talking about customers, but the idea of ooching applies for any project or any goal that you're working on. You may also be familiar with this whole idea of that lean startup and lean and agile methodology. And again, that has a similar idea. So Eric Ries, who wrote the book, The Lean Startup, he says you build a minimum viable product, the smallest thing that you're happy to share with customers so you can get feedback from them. So again, it doesn't have to be customer facing, but whatever goal you're working on, do an ooch first. And the second thing, if you remember, the other column in here is about who. So this is an idea that I learned from a master coach, Dan Sullivan. And Dan Sullivan has written a book called Who, Not How. Now, many of us will be familiar with Simon Sinek's work on Start With Why. And starting with why is good because then you know that you're motivated even when things get tough. Dan Sullivan says, as soon as you know what you're going to work on, the next question to ask is who. So who are you going to ask to do this work for you? It might be who are you going to delegate this to? Who are you going to outsource this to? Who is the best person to collaborate with? Who in your team are you going to give a leadership role to take charge of this project? So every time you've got an action, if you can put a who next to it, it does two things. One, it means that you're putting somebody in charge who perhaps has the right skills and expertise. And also, it takes a little bit of the burden off you. Okay, so as your action plan, if you've got a little bit of paper, and as we're going through the ideas today, when you write down an action that you're going to do or a project that you're going to work on, write down your ooch, the first little pilot project or the prototype that you can do. And the second thing to do is ask yourself, who am I going to delegate this to, outsource this to, or collaborate with? Okay, so those are just a little bit of a way for you to get more value from this presentation. So let's look at some of these skills for the future. And the first one is very much as a result of COVID-19, that people have reevaluated what matters to them, what's important to them, what doesn't matter to them anymore. And they want to do work that matters and in a workplace that matters as well. So what sort of things are you looking for in work? And people are looking for different things in work. You may have heard that there's this great resignation, this great reshuffle, great look for flexibility in work, and that is true. And for people who have the luxury to be able to choose where they work, and that's increasingly happening, then they're looking for a work and workplace that matters. So let me do a little bit of a poll here. So I said I want this to be interactive. So let's start with the poll. So this poll here is about your organizational culture. So, have you got a culture that's going to be attracting the best people? And yes, so it's nice to see that there's the majority of people say that it's 80%, right? 80%, more than 80% of people say that their organizational culture has improved as a result of the pandemic. Okay, the numbers are going down a little bit, but still pretty close to 80%. Okay, so thank you very much for doing that. Let me share with you some research that was done by the Society for Human Resource Management, and they asked this question, and this is fairly recent research, so this was done just this year, and one of the questions they asked people in organizations, has your overall organizational culture improved during the pandemic, and do you agree with that statement or not? And interestingly, they found that most leaders, managers said, yes, our organizational culture has improved, which is really good, right? It's really good to say that leaders are thinking that their organizational culture has not only got worse because of all the stress and anxiety, but actually the opposite is improved. The bad news is the employees, the non-leaders who are asked that same question, they weren't so positive about it. They were much, much, much lower. So my question for you is, like, if you say your organizational culture has got a bit better or a lot better, fantastic. My real question for you is, how do you know? And what practices are you putting in place to be sure that you're not fooling yourself into thinking that the culture is better when in fact everybody in your team thinks that no, it hasn't. In fact, maybe it's got worse. So that's the first question for you, and I'm not going to answer that for you. I think that I'll leave that for you to figure out for yourself what you're going to put into place that you can test and assess the temperature of your organizational culture or your team culture, of course. So if you're a team leader, this applies to your team. Okay. So on a more positive note, I want you to do this little exercise here. And if you're thinking about what you need to do to improve the culture in your team or your organization, what sort of things are you going to set as your baseline standards, or maybe even standards that will show that you're an excellent culture, the sort of place that people will want to work at? Okay, so the sort of things that you might put in there, let me show you some sort of things that you might write down as standards. And what I'm going to do is I'll give you a list here. You don't have to choose from this list, and then I'll give you about a minute where I'll stop talking and give you the chance to write down for yourself what sort of things you're going to put into place. So for example, it could be something that says leaders prioritize respect in the culture. We've got diverse and inclusive workplaces. We've got systems that are there that support performance and growth in our team members, and a whole bunch of other things. So you can see the list here. So I'm going to give you a minute to write down for yourself what sort of things you're going to put into place. I'm not going to ask you to share, so you can write down things for yourself. You might think these are relevant to you and you need to apply some of them. You might have some others for yourself. I'll give you 45 seconds to do that. Okay, so let me start the clock and I'll stop talking. Okay, thank you for doing that, folks. As I said, I'm not going to ask you to share with other people in the room. And, like you might say some of these things are relevant. So you might say these are really basic and we should be doing them anyway. Look, I reckon if you said that, I'd agree with you. But in case some of those look a bit familiar, if you've read Kate Jenkins' report about the standards in Australian Parliament, that report that was released last week, just talking about the appalling behaviour and the appalling systemic culture in the Australian Parliament, these are some of the recommendations from the report that would raise the standard of people working in our Commonwealth parliamentary offices. So if you think they're pretty basic, I'd agree with you, and yet our parliamentarians and their staff, that culture still doesn't have anywhere near those standards. These are the recommendations. Okay, I just want to quickly stop and check if there's any questions. You can ask questions at any time. Just ask them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat room and answer any questions as they come along. Or if you've got comments that you want to share, I'm happy for you to share them as well. If you want to turn on your microphone and speak out loud, you're welcome to do that as well. And don't do that while I'm talking, but if you want to write in the chat, you're welcome to do that at any time. And when I stop for questions, I'll read what's in the chat. I don't see any coming in at the moment. So let's continue. If you've got questions about this or any of the stuff we've covered previously, feel free to ask that later as well. This isn't your only chance. Okay, so the next one is about reskilling and upskilling. So there's no question. I think we all know that we need that the future is changing, jobs are changing, skills are changing, and we need different skills to be future proof and future ready. Whenever I speak at conferences in person, I always encourage people to come and talk to me afterwards and have a chat. And one of the most common questions I get asked is, what should my kids study at school so that they'll have a job in the future? And I always say it's not about jobs, it's about skills. So what skills do they need? Absolutely get some deep expertise in the particular area they want to go into, but also build up as many broad skills as they can, not just in school and university, but broadly, more broadly than that as well. Let me share with you two bits of research from the World Economic Forum. There's lots of sources for this, but the World Economic Forum I picked because they focus on jobs and skills. So two things they say is, number one, the average employee needs 25 days a year for upskilling and reskilling. So 25 days a year is 5 weeks, 5 working weeks. So are you giving your team members 5 weeks of training, of upskilling? And it doesn't have to be formalized sitting in a training room. It could be online training. It could be some specific on-the-job training. It could be shadowing. It could be some sort of mentoring program that you provide for them. Are you providing that? That's 5 weeks. The second one is that this World Economic Forum research was done last year, and it looked at Australia, and they said, and the research said that Australians know that they're going to need new skills for the future, and most of them expect that their employer is going to provide them with those skills. So if you are that employer, then just be aware that if you're not providing them, then maybe your people are going to be looking elsewhere. Okay. Alvin Toffler said in the last century, which is quite a long time, more than 20 years ago now, he said the people who are going to be considered illiterate now are not the ones who can't read and write. They're the ones who they're not active learners. They're not willing to learn, relearn, and even unlearn things that used to be true but aren't true anymore. And it's very easy for me to stand here and say you need to be an active learner, you need to upskill your people, you need to do reskilling, but it's very difficult when the world is changing quickly and you're always scrambling to get the basics done. So I think the best way around that is to build a habit. And I always say, whenever you're coming to do any sort of change, if you can build a habit, it's better than trying to be disciplined to do it. Habit always trumps discipline. So you know that however busy you are in your day, you're always going to brush your teeth twice a day. You know that doesn't matter how much of a rush you are in to get somewhere, you're going to put on your seatbelt when you get into the car, because those are habits. And if you can build habits around them, then it's much easier than having to discipline yourself to do them. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 areas in which you can build habits around learning and upskilling and reskilling. This is for yourself and for your team. And then I know there's lots of expertise in the room here today, so I'm going to break us into groups and I'm going to ask you to share examples that you've seen of really positive learning habits in workplaces that you've been part of, or perhaps that you're in a part of now, or perhaps that you may have even heard of from other people. Let me give you some ideas first, and then we'll break into groups. Okay, so the first one is time. So are you actually allocating time for reskilling, upskilling, and for learning? And time as a habit, as opposed to saying, we'll do this when we've got time. Are you actually making time? Are you baking it in to your normal operations? So you could do things like this. So Google, around innovation, you may know that Google had a thing called 20% time, where you could spend, every engineer at Google was given 20% of their time, like 1 day a week, to work on whatever they liked. And they could invent whatever. And somebody invented Gmail on their 20% time. Now, some Google engineers would say it was really 120% time, because you expected to do that in addition to everything else, but at least they had the principle. Now, you may not be willing to allow your team members to have 1 day a week for learning and upskilling, but how much would you give? What if it was 10%? That's half a day a week. Is that still too much? What about 5%? Would you be willing to say that you'd be willing to give 5% of time to every employee to spend on their upskilling and learning? So that's 2 hours a week in a typical 40-hour week. Here's this one thing you could do, and that becomes it becomes a habit. So you could get to the point where you say, how did you spend your 2 hours this week? Or maybe you let them bank it up for 4 weeks and you say, each month, how do you spend your learning time? And make that front of mind. The next thing is money. So are you allowing some proportion of your budget for reskilling, learning, and upskilling? I was talking to a senior manager once, and she was really unhappy because she wanted to send her 3 team members to a conference, and it was going to cost like $200 a day, which is hardly anything, given that she's in charge of $1 million plus budget. But she didn't have the ability, she didn't have the discretion to be able to provide a few $100s for each of those employees. So have you got a training budget that you've got discretion over? Ideally, are you even giving the responsibility for training to your team members and say, you've got $500, let's say, a year to spend on training. You can choose what to spend it on. For myself, as the only employee of my company, I put aside from the salary that my company pays me every month, I put aside a percentage that goes into a separate bank account, which is my education account. And that money's been like set aside and earmarked for that purpose. So then when it comes to, do I want to attend a conference? Do I want to enroll in some online program? That money's already been put aside. I don't have to think about what am I giving up. So is there some way that you can allow, that you can put money into as a habit into your learning and training? And the last thing is, of course, the people. Are you making it front of mind? Are you saying, for example, these are things that I've seen, every second staff meeting, somebody's given the chance to teach something that they've learned? Or is it that you set up a mentoring program so that people are matched up with mentors? And they don't only have to be older, more senior people. You can have reverse mentoring as well, where people are mentored by more junior people or younger people. Okay, so those are just some examples. I want to now ask you to break up into groups, and I'll give you the chance to share things that you've seen. So what learning habits have you seen, or what things have you seen done well in organizations, in groups? Whenever I run this in masterclasses where we have lots of discussion and lots of ideas come out of it, and when we write them up on a flip chart or a whiteboard, it's just amazing to see what organizations are doing to create learning and the opportunity for upskilling in organizations. And some people are doing it really proactively, and some people are doing it kind of just randomly when it happens. And that's why I think if you build it in, if you build habits, that's much better than trying to do it when we have time, because of course that's never going to happen. There's a comment here from somebody I know quite well, Ruth, who's a senior leader, I think Transport New Zealand, and she says that I'm one of the, I think she's talking about habit versus discipline. She says one of the most disciplined people that she knows. Little do you know, Ruth, because a lot of this is trying to build habits in. So things like getting up early, and the first couple of things I do are not just answering emails, but they're doing important work in the morning, setting aside Fridays for working on the business rather than in the business. These sort of habits that you build in give you some rules and guidelines to work within. And I think that makes a big difference, especially in a busy, fast-changing, always interrupted world. The other thing I reckon that when I work with groups I see quite often is that even the leaders and managers who are really keen on making sure that their people get upskilled and learn, and they sometimes forget about themselves. So I'd like to, before we finish this topic, I'd like to ask you, what will you learn by this time next year? So what do you know that right now you don't have competence in, but if we were running this 12 months from now, you would have competence in. So it could be something in your professional life, it could be something in your personal life, because it's not about your age or your seniority or your grey hair. It's about always being an active learner. So just write down for yourself in your action plan, what are you going to learn by this time next year? And then where are you going to learn it? But don't worry about the how too much, but you could go to Coursera and do kind of university level courses free of charge. You could go to masterclass.com, and for I think it's now like $30 a month, you can sign up to all the classes taught by experts. So some years ago I signed up to Learn Comedy from Steve Martin, and I found it was a fabulous course. My family doesn't agree, but learn comedy from Steve Martin, learn tennis from Serena Williams, learn horror writing from Stephen King, and these classes are available for just like $30 a month, and it's worth doing. It's worth, if you've never done it before, try it out. Okay, let's have a look. Sophie says, I've enrolled in a grad cert in people and culture starting in January. Yeah, terrifying to go back to uni, but hugely exciting. Absolutely. And there's so many people now who are building, going into and doing skills for them, learning skills for themselves, as well as organizations that are providing that. Bala says, are very valuable about that one. Oh, Julia, great to see you here as well. Keep learning Te Reo in New Zealand. And there's a question that came up earlier. Let me just go back to that because we're up to questions now. Before we go into the third trend, I want to talk about diversity and inclusion. Julia says, COVID's been a complete game changer, an exciting opportunity for organizations to provide meaningful learning opportunities. Yeah, and look, the best organizations have always done that. It's just that now it's become a need to do, not just a like to do. Bala, talking about ooching, what time frame to change plans and strategies to act fast enough? So when you're doing an ooch, the idea is, the quick answer is it depends. The idea is you take a little step to give you enough feedback. So, Bala, I think you're at TAFE New South Wales. So if you decide to do reverse mentoring, where all of the senior people are going to be mentored by somebody more junior in the organization, you don't have to roll out a whole mentoring program. Why don't you just find somebody to be your mentor, your reverse mentor, try it, see how it goes, and see, maybe get a few other people involved. If you're doing something that's more involved, like if you're doing a software app development, then it might take a while to build an app to the point where you're ready to launch it on the App Store to get initial feedback. So it really does depend. The real test is not so much how long it is, but how quickly can you get feedback to decide whether you're on the right track or not.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, good. I think I went through the questions, so let's continue. Let's do this third area. It's one that I'm really quite interested in because it's a trend that's is big in the news at the moment, and there's good reasons for it: diversity, inclusion, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's start with a little bit of a puzzle. I've got a little bit of a puzzle for you to take part in here, and this is a true story, and this happened in an American university many decades ago. So this is a physics professor, and he gave his students a physics exam, and one of the questions in the exam said, how would you use a barometer to measure the height of a tall building? Now, because this was a physics exam, the answer he was looking for was it's about air pressure. So you measure the pressure at the bottom of the building, at the ground level. You go to the top, measure the pressure there, and then there's a formula for pressure differential. You can calculate the height of the building. One of the students wrote, I would tie a rope to the end of the barometer, reel it out over the top of the building, pull it up, measure the length of the rope, and that will tell me the height of the building. Now, of course, he was marked wrong. But he protested and he said, no, this is just as correct. And so the professor asked his mates and said, what do you think? And they said, well, actually, that is a valid answer, so you have to give him full marks for that. And this kind of leaked to the world. There was no social media at that time, but it was leaked to a newspaper, and then people were writing letters to the editor of how they would use a barometer to measure the height of a tall building. So I've given you two options here. Two ways that you can use a barometer to measure the height of a building. I'd like you, just now, in the chat, to give me some other ideas. How would you use a barometer to measure the height of a building? And I'll then share 6 of them with you, 6 others with you. Let's see how we go. I shared this with a group a couple of years ago. Actually, this was pre-pandemic, but we were doing an online presentation. And one of the respondents, which is, again, a valid answer, he said, just Google how to use a barometer to measure the height of a building. And sure enough, there's lots of answers there. So, and that's okay, but how else would you do it? I want to see what responses are coming in. Drop from the top. Jackie says measure how long it takes to fall. Yeah, so use the formula for gravity, and you've got to take into account air pressure and so on. Drop it to measure the time, which is what Jürgen's saying. Okay, let me give you some other examples and some other answers, and I think people are still typing others as well, so that's okay. But let me give you 6 other ways that you could use a barometer to measure the height of a tall building. So one of them is to calculate the length of the shadows, to compare them. So shade. I think that's the one that Jürgen was just about to say as well, shadows, yes. Another one is you could tie it to the end of a string and then swing it like a pendulum and use a frequency to calculate the length of the string, which gives you the height of the building. You could do the answer that we've got already, which is drop it from the top and calculate the time that it takes to fall. There's a Spider-Man version, which is that you find out how long the barometer is and then scale the wall of the building to find out how many barometer widths it is, or barometer heights. And if you don't have Spider-Man handy, you can just do it with one floor and then multiply that by the number of floors. And then the other one is you could simply go to the owner of the building and say, I'll give you a brand new barometer if you tell me how tall this building is. Okay, so my point is this, that as a group, people find more answers than just doing it by themselves. And this is going to be really important in our future. In the past, the wisdom and experience that comes from age and longevity has been really valuable in bringing us into the future. And that's still true to some extent, but in the future, which is so different from the past, we're going to need diversity and inclusion. And so let me do a little exercise around this. I've got a poll around this, and then I'll share with you some research around diversity and inclusion in workplaces. Okay, so I want you to answer these questions about yourself. So how many of these things apply to you? I've got a poll question coming up, but these are kind of personal things, so I'm not going to ask you to answer specifically for yourself in the poll, whether these apply to you or not. I'm going to share 8 things, and I'm going to ask you to score yourself on how many of them you say yes to. I'll give you a couple of examples. So if you're male, that counts as 1. If you're white, that counts as another 1. So for me, that doesn't count. If you're heterosexual, that counts as 1. If you're not, it doesn't count. Okay, so that's the idea. There's 8 of them. Okay, let's start again. All right, so just count for yourself silently. I'm not asking you to share in the chat, but what I'll do in the poll is then ask you to share what you got from 0 to 8. And the poll's anonymous, and I'm not asking you to share the specific things. Okay, so how many of these apply? Male, if you identify as male, count as 1. If you're white, count as 1. If you're heterosexual, count as 1. If you're elsewhere on the sexuality spectrum, that doesn't count. If you're either Christian or non-religious, that counts as 1. If you observe some other religion, that doesn't count. If you're university educated, that counts as 1, so at least a university bachelor's degree. If you've got secure employment, and secure for the purposes of this means non-casual. So if you're full-time, part-time, contract, we'll count that as secure employment. If the sort of work you do allows you to work from home, that counts, whether or not your current employer allows that. If you're doing this kind of office work that allows you to work from home, that counts. And the last one is if you own property, that counts. All right, so you should have a score out of 8. And what we're going to do is just go to the poll again. I've got a second poll set up for you. And all I'm asking you to do in the poll is just share your score. And I'm not asking you to share any of the specific things. And if you've already got the poll, so most people, or the majority, has numbers 7, but we've got, let's say, 6, 7, and 8 is, what's that, 14, 7, 20, 21, no, that's not right, what am I doing, 34, so that's 70% have higher than 5, and we're up to 95% are 5 or higher. Okay, so what's the meaning of this? So this is all about privilege. Okay, and when I talk about diversity and inclusion, especially in my masterclasses, quite often the question comes up about privilege. Now, some people here will understand the concept of privilege, and maybe you don't. And if you don't, privilege gives you a head start. So privilege, if you're running a 100-meter dash, privilege means that you don't all start at the same starting line. And so every one of those things gives you a little bit of an extra head start. So it's like, and this is not a perfect metaphor, but it's like running a 100-meter race, and every point that you scored in that last poll gives you a 10-meter head start. So if you identify as male, you've got a little bit of a 10-meter head start of people who don't identify as male. Similarly, white. Similarly, heterosexual. And it's kind of like because society has been set up to privilege those sort of people, not at an individual level, but at a systemic level. If you're, and talking about Australia and New Zealand, if you're Christian, then society's kind of set up for that. Laws are kind of designed by Christians. There's more place of worship. Your main religious holidays happen to be public holidays, so you don't need to take extra leave to be able to observe your religion, and so on. Okay, so those first four are things that probably have been with you most of your life. There are other things that you may have earned, like university degrees, employment, working from home, and owning property. Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but a lot of that comes from property ownership, and many people aren't part of that wealth because of that. But even the things that you earned possibly came because your parents had the ability to give you the chance to go to university and then get that secure employment, and so on. So my point is this. So, by the way, I score 7 out of 8. Like many people here in the room. So, I was terrible at sports at school, but I reckon in a 100-meter race, if I had a 70-meter head start, even Usain Bolt would have a pretty good, tough time catching me up. And I'm making this point for two things. So apart from just explaining what privilege is for those who have never come across the concept, the fact that head start means that some things are easier. And in our world now, things aren't really easy. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of ongoing change happening in the world. And I reckon, like if you're straight white male and you've got all these advantages, then maybe you haven't had to go through some of the challenges that, say, if you were a trans woman of color, well, I reckon people like that have had lots of experiences of resilience and working through obstacles and having to stand up for things that matter to them. And that's really going to be, those are really valuable skills for our future. And this is not just a theoretical concept. The research shows that having diversity in your teams, in other words, having people who aren't all scoring high on this scale, actually is good for the bottom line. So obviously it's the right thing to do. But also, if you're completely selfish and you only care about the bottom line, it's also a good thing to do. And the research is pretty clear about this now, that if you want to look up the research, Bankwest and Curtin Economics Center, they publish a Gender Equity Insights report every year. This year's report is good, but last year's report is the one that I'm referring you to here, which you can download. That's the report from last year that shows all the research that shows there's a causal link between greater diversity in your team, especially at senior leadership levels, and product and profitability and the bottom line and performance. Okay, so it's not just a case of doing it because it's the right thing, even though that's a good enough reason. Do it also because it helps your bottom line. And obviously, there's reasons for that. One is, as I said, because people from different lived experiences have had to go through things that other people haven't. But also, if half your employees are women, if half your customers are women, if half of the people that in your community are women, then shouldn't you have 50% female representation at senior leadership and at board level? Okay, and that applies to all the other groups as other areas as well. So I'd like you to write down, as for your action in this area, what are you going to do to increase diversity? And it doesn't have to be strictly in your team, but increase diversity in your thinking and in your team's thinking. One last thing I want to share around that before we finish up is I love this quotation from Michael Houston from the Grey Group, and he talks about the value of diversity for innovation and change. And he says, when you bring in diverse points of view, it's not going to be easy, right? It says here, sparks, arguments, failures, and heated tempers. And if that's not really your thing, then maybe innovation isn't right for you. And I think that's a really important thing to think about as well. As much as we create innovation programs, if we don't have the foundation of diverse teams who are working in those programs, then we're missing out the most valuable part of innovation. Okay, that's the last thing, the last of the three trends that I want to cover, and we're pretty much at time. So we've covered those three, and I've just give you a few more seconds to either ask questions or add notes to the action plan that you're putting together. Okay, and if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them. Let me see what's come in. Oh, Dan says, yes, massive open online courses. MOOCs are very useful. Yes, so Coursera, which I mentioned earlier, that's a website which has MOOCs on them. Yeah, huge on open courses online. And don't think they're just watching lectures and sitting there in isolation. The best MOOCs have a lot of interactivity, collaboration, and diversity, because you're in classrooms with students from literally all around the world. Okay, I see some thank yous coming in, which is fantastic. Sophie says, let's hope the Ashes continues like day one. I agree with you, Sophie, there. Just to finish up, if you want to get in touch with me about these sort of topics and talking about with your team about these sort of topics, then I do a number of things. You can find them at gihanspeaks.com or gihanpereira.com. Whether you want to engage me as a keynote presenter for your conference, to run masterclasses, or to help you with your future planning. If you want to, my last message to you, if you want to take action now. So don't wait for everything to be lined up perfectly. Don't wait for the start, don't wait for New Year's Eve and New Year's Day to start. Don't wait till everyone gets back into the office after the Christmas break, and start before you're ready, because the world won't wait for you. Thanks everyone. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please get in touch at gihanpereira.com. All my contact details are there. If you're watching this live, I'll send out the recording afterwards. And if you're watching the recording, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy your break that you're taking in the next couple of months. See you in 2022.